Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first DCD Discover Dialogues. And I'm very excited that our first guest is Karen Pheasant-Neganigwane. I almost got it, Karen.
You did
Oh,
very well. You did pretty good. Neganigwane.
Neganigwane.
Nah.
Now I'm self-conscious, right? Because there are people here listening, right? So, yeah.
It's okay.
For those who don't know me, I'm Amy Bowring. I'm the executive and curatorial director at Dance Collection Danse. And we've created this series to just have some interesting casual conversations with people in dance who are doing work in, performance studies and pedagogy and publishing books and that kind of thing. So that's where we wanted to start. Now, Karen, I think you wanted to do a land acknowledgement, and then I also wanted to acknowledge where we are. Would you like to speak first?
Sure. Okay. Bonjour, Danse. Okay, ambe wishde. I bring greetings to you, and I use the terms from, sitting right now in Treaty 7, which I see one of our attendees is Troy Twig, who's a Treaty 7 nation member. I've spent many years living, working, being in Treaty 7, and it is a place of Calgary, Alberta, where the Nisitsippi, Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Dene people, and then Stoney Nakotas live in this area. And I also understand one of the regional offices of the Métis people reside here. I do want to say at this time that sometimes what gets left out in our land acknowledgements is the Anishinaabe, which I am, of the Three Fires Confederacy, had a history of coming through this territory to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. There's actually, I heard Jimmy Ochies talk about that story of the migratory path of the Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes to out this way. So when I ended up living out here 12 years ago, I felt like I'm rekindling and following those steps. And I was still consider myself, although I have a lot of adopted family members here with the Stonies, Tsuut'ina and Mississippi nations, I still think of myself as a visitor, and I'm appreciative and grateful of the Mino Babatsuan, the good life that I have with my relatives here in Treaty 7. Hi, miigwech.
Thank you, Karen. And I wanted to just take a moment to recognize where Dance Collection Danse is located, because we're in Toronto, and this is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And we are very grateful for all of the caretakers, both recorded and unrecorded, of this land and of Turtle Island. And Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to work and dance in this community on this territory. And I also just wanted to recognize my own ancestors who came in the 1740s to the island of what is now called Newfoundland, which was the territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and that European presence eventually led to the demise of the Beothuk people. They were forced off the coasts into the inland areas of Newfoundland, where it was much harder to live off of the land with no access to the coast and so on. And it's important to take account of that presence and what it has done to the first peoples who were here when the Europeans came. So as I said, Karen is our guest today, and we're very excited to have you. Karen is an Anishinaabe scholar. She's currently working on her PhD at the University of Alberta, specializing in Indigenous pedagogy. In addition to her doctoral studies, she has been an instructor at the University of Alberta and is also an assistant professor at Mount Royal University, which she has mentioned is the Treaty 7 region. She is a lifelong powwow dancer and the author of an award-winning book called Powwow, A Celebration Through Song and Dance, which takes readers on a journey through powwow's history and today's thriving powwow culture. In the book, Karen discusses protocols, regalia, songs, dances, and foods of powwow culture from coast to coast. It's a book that has been recommended by the Canadian Indigenous Books for Schools list for grades 4 to 8. And I have to say that even though you had written it specifically for that age category, for someone who knew very little about powwow, this is a fantastic introduction. And I would love to hear about the impetus for writing the book. What got you to embark on this project?
Miigwech. Thank you, Amy. So all of you, thank you for being here. I realize that I'm in the midst of writing about dance and it's how it ontologically grounded me, like my way of being. And so I'm going to switch back between speaking like a academic, speaking as a dancer, and speaking from the res, because that's just the way I communicate. So before I go into that question, and Amy, you might have to bring me on board back again about the driving force, because I want to talk about that driving force. But before I talk about that driving force, the context of my being, and so for those of you that don't know me, I'm from Wikwemikong First Nations. Both my parents are from Wikwemikong, or as I'm sure Troy knows, it's called Wiki. That's the short version of, if you've been there, then you know it's called Wiki. So both my parents, my paternal and maternal grandparents, also are from Wikwemikong. And so when I'm writing or speaking, I do my utmost to recall what they did, because I was just sharing that my grandparents all were born in the late 1800s. So they were born in a time where they still, their parents, before Canada was colonized. Um, I was too young to appreciate, but my grandpa could recite talking about the War of 1812. And he had a grandpa. We have lineage of the Treaty of Niagara, where one of the first treaties, and so where nations from all over Canada came there. And so sometimes when I'm introducing myself, I say I'm from the Great Lakes, because prior to Confederation, we followed, just like the Beatok people, they followed where so it's, this David Suzuki talks about being ecology wise and everything, but so he adopted and watched us. So I have lineage on my both maternal and paternal side of being from, on my mother's side, Menominee from Wisconsin, Odawa from Michigan, Haudenosaunee. I'm very impressed, Amy, that you could pronounce Haudenosaunee. So from Akwesasne. So in that way, I'm have mixed of a lot of nations. So that's why I say I'm Anishinaabe of the Three Fires Confederacy, which is Wodawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. So, and then I just want to take a split second to talk, because you introduced about the Beathuk people.
Mm.
Ironically, one of my colleagues at Mount Royal has just asked me to read a chapter. He wrote a history book, because I'm going to cite Justice Senator Murray Sinclair in here. And when he did it, and I don't know if you're note taking, but he did an interview with TV Ontario called Reflections on Reconciliation. And I always make sure and say this, that he said, it's our school curriculum, it's our Canadian school system that perpetuates white supremacy.
Mhm.
And so in that, so you don't hear these histories, it's like of the Beothuk people. So my colleague, kudos to him, Alan Dyer, Dyer, has a whole chapter on the extinction of that nation of people. And he's asked me to read that chapter before it goes to press for my comments. Not that I'm a historian, but just looking at the way maybe the perception, the lens of which he shares these. And so I was sitting having breakfast prior to us getting together with my other Mount Royal colleague who read it already. And she just talked about how traumatizing the chapter is. So I said, well, I guess because I'm in the middle of writing my dissertation right now, I said I better write my first draft because these stories are so tragic, and who knows why the Canadian school system doesn't let these. And so even with my book, and like you said, beyond grade 4 to 8, if you could put up the other book, Indigenous Stories of Indigenous Toronto, I talk about my journey into dance in there. And so I talk about how my parents took me. I mean, I'm from Wikwemikong, which is home to Eastern Canada's first powwow. That powwow has been going on for 60 years. So I always seen it at home when visitors came. But my first distance powwow was to Thunder Bay in Treaty 3 region when I was a very young teenager. My parents took me and took us traveling around and out west and all of that. And so my mom, when she read this book, she just said, I did not know so much of this. And my mom's a very, I like to, even though both my parents are residential school survivors, I like to think of them because society really does a number on conditioning Indians as the drunk, stupid, lazy Indian.
Yeah.
And I think maybe a reality is that that's what triggers me. When you say what got you to write this, and even my PhD dissertation, because even though my parents made a choice, they didn't want me to go to residential school, they wanted me to go to a public school, so we moved in town. They managed to somehow keep me in a cultural bubble. And because Toronto has such a big, large, diverse Indigenous population, my Manitoulin Island, Wikwemikong, we have a very large, like Troy's been in Toronto for quite some time, and he probably knows dozens and dozens of people from Wikwemikong. We have a big community there. So my home in Toronto became like Grand Central Station. People came in, they stayed at the house and went to their medical appointments. So I managed to live in this cultural bubble and then as a youth worked at the Indian Center. And then when I got old enough, when I was in my early 20s, I went back to the res and then moved out here to Alberta and have been out here off and on since the early 80s. So my perception of us is that we're beautiful, brilliant, amazing people. And then when I left my bubble and people defined us to this day, I have a whiteboard story that I tell at UofA when I was teaching, and I heard almost 500 students say that our problem is that we're drunk, lazy alcoholics. This is 2017 that they said this. So knowing that I grew up that I've sometimes used the acronym ABC, amazing, brilliant, and courageous. So that's what triggers. So we're beyond the aesthetics of, oh, look at those children, they're so cute. And so the first chapter is completely about colonization. And even sometimes when I listen to newbie powwow dancers and I hear the stories, like the stories sometimes that I hear about how some of these dances came to be, I'm like, where did they hear that?
Right.
I'm of the generation where they weren't called powwows. I always remember we were living in Lethbridge and there was a winter dance at Gladstone Hall on the Blood Reserve. So somebody told us, you girls should come. We just moved to Lethbridge. You girls should come. There's going to be a dance tonight. You should come over there. So my sister's pressing her jeans. This is back in the day where you pressed your jeans. And she's combing her hair and making it all. And me, myself, I just throw on a shirt and a t-shirt and pull up a pair of jeans and off I go. So off we went. We did the lipstick and the mascara, and we went to the big dance. We get there, and it's a powwow. We're from the east, so we call them powwow. But when we were there, and even when they had their summer homecoming, which in the Midwest, some places call them homecomings, it was called Indian Days. So I'm going to back up a bit, because in the very first page of the book, I talk about my love of dance. So I did meet, and going back to your question of what got you to write this, I have a dedication, and I don't have the book handy by me because I'm on the road, but in the way in the back, I dedicated to 60 Scoop.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, like, it was an eye-opener when I moved out here, because I lived, and maybe I still live in this cultural bubble, you know, just go to powwows, go to Indian education workshops, um, around Indians all the time. So when I moved out here and I lived in Edmonton, they asked me at the local friendship center to teach powwow dance. So, and which I used to do when I was living in Ontario and on our reserve communities. So I went, and the attendees were generally foster parents or adopted parents who had First Nations children. And they wanted to do something to bring culture to their children. And powwow was their way that, you know, some of these children had no clue. I remember being at Prince Charles School, which is the Aboriginal focus school in Edmonton, and I would ask a child, where are you from? Which is a standard cultural question. You know, if I was to, for those of you that don't know Troy, him and I we're from the same dance community and known each other for, I don't know, a long time. But if we didn't know each other, he would ask me where I'm from. Where are you from? He would say, and I would say right away, Kwamekong. Then in his head, he'd think, oh, she's Anishinaabe. I would ask him, where are you from? And he'd say, oh, the Bloods. And I'd automatically know he's that history. So I would ask these students at this elementary public school, and they told me they're Aboriginal. And I'm like none of us, I'm Anishinaabe. I never ever introduced myself as Aboriginal. So after the third time, I realized, well, and this happened over a period of time, I realized that there's a large population base, particularly here in the prairie provinces, of Aboriginal people. Not to say it isn't anywhere else in Canada, it is. What I came to realize, if you were to Google Indian Residential Schools Canada, in one of the Googles, you'll come up with a map, and it has all the dots where the residential schools are in Canada. And what you will see is a very high number in the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And as most of you might know, the last school was closed in 96. So everyone of my generation here on the prairie provinces went to residential school. That was a shocker to me and an eye-opener. So you have multi-generations of babies being taken until they're preteens and then released out. To sometimes their parents have passed away, they've become so disconnected. And then, as Cindy Blackstock says, we now have more children in care than we had in the residential school system. So if you're following my digression and my tangent of story here, so putting me back in teaching dance, powwow dance, here's parents who are foster parents or adopted parents to First Nations children and have no clue how to get them into their identity. So they take them to a powwow. So that in part that was that.
Mm,
But I opened with a dance story because I never went into powwow to find my identity.
mhm,
If anything, I might say permission. And I write about it in the book because this is where I could just be me.
mhm.
And one of the things that to this day, I'm a faculty member and have gotten in trouble because I'm not silent, because I call stuff out.
Yeah.
I call out white fragility in the academy. And so at a powwow, it was just freedom,
Uh-huh.
laughing, storytelling. At the back camp, there'd be a little ceremony going over there, and the drum would start, and you'd go and you just, I mean, within your, um, because one of the controversial topics right now is how um, some dance categories are leaving their foundational form of essence, I'll say. And, almost I almost witnessed kind of a Cirque du Soleil happening on the powwow floor with the creativity, artistic creativity happening. But going back to your question of what brought me, so I did dedicate it to the 60s scoop, but I also I talked briefly, very small in both stories, I think, of my love of dance and watching Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, Gene Kelly, all of those, and just having a love. And so, I mean, that's as a very little girl, 6 years old, 7 years old. And my mom talks about me tugging at her dress when I was, I don't know, 7, 8 years old at our powwow, saying, "Mommy, make me a powwow dress." And it wasn't it, it's a new cultural phenomenon of the 60s.
Mhm.
And so in those days, you could count on two hands, one in Ontario with Kwemekong, and then a few in Manitoba, a few in Saskatchewan and Alberta. So by the time I became a very young woman in the early 20s, and Renee Highway, and I spoke briefly in the second book, um, he was doing community dance at the Friendship Center on Spadina Road. And I was like, I finally, at this old age of 21, I get to do a dance class with, and we all hung out at the Indian Center, Thompson Highway, Billy Moresti, Renee,
Mhm.
and we all, nobody was famous then. We were just doing what we needed to do to survive. I was the program director of the children's program. Thompson was the provincial coordinator at the Federation office. And Renee was, doing what he could. And then he was doing this dance class on the second floor at the Friendship Center. And I did it, the plies and that. And somehow I thought, I don't think this is the dance that I wanted to do. But what he did is he added kindle to the flames of my desire to dance. So I left the city, stopped in Kwemekong for a year, and then did the Powwow Trail here in the Prairie Provinces, the first being at the World Assembly of First Nations in 1982, and then over down in Treaty 7 at Piikani and Kainai and all of that. And so my being here in Treaty 7 has always been one of those anchor places for my dance, for my love, for the passion of it. And so in my time, and so I don't know what page it is, but I have a drum story that I include in my book, and it's with Evelyn Eagle Speaker. And the Eagle Speakers are a renowned family on the Blood Reserve, and um, protocol speaking, traditionally speaking, um, Anishinaabe woman, we don't drum.
Mhm.
So even, the recent Grammy nomination, and Fawn Wood, she doesn't hand drum she'll have somebody who will hand drum, but she sings.
Uh-huh.
So that's the generation, or that's the teachings, or that's the understanding that I come from. and I stay with them. Not to say that nothing doesn't change. There's a lot of changes in culture, and I'm not sure who the gatekeepers are, but I do. So one time in breaking the gate, so in short, I'll just quickly recap that story that's in the book.
Yeah.
Um, I know that as an Anishinaabe, we don't sit at the drum, but I do sing. And in those days, I sang quite a bit. As I'm getting ready, no, I'm not going to sing. But anyway, Evelyn and her sister Bertie had a drum with their sons, I think, and a couple other singers from the Bloods. And all of a sudden, I'm not sure what happened, but there was an empty seat at their drum and they had to sing. And next thing you know, she just hands me a stick and tells me to go. And it's much like when you're invited for dinner and someone pulls a chair, you don't say, oh no, I'm full. Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe some people do, but you still sit down, they pull the chair and you sit down and join them at the dinner table. It's the same with singing. So they did that and I awkwardly did, and I was honored to sing. And it's a long story. It's in the book. I'm not going to finish it, but so when you say what are the reasons for you doing this, is one is many weren't born fortunate to be born into this life, and then two is my pure love of dance.
Mhm.
And so, but as I said, going back to where I discussed at the very beginning, I think of our Indigenous dances as our political activism.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
And you
and
talk
it's,
about the ban too. You talk a bit about the ban on dance, which is still, when I mention that to people, that there was a ban on various indigenous dances from 1884 to 1951, people are shocked. And I think it's partly because people think of dance as kind of this frivolous activity, but it's not that. It has political implications and it has spiritual implications. And the government clearly saw how important it was when they decided to ban it, because it was, one more way of oppressing an entire group of people.
and yeah, and at this time, what I want to make sure and differentiate,
Mm,
because sometimes the context that people talk about that ban is, do realize that powwow dance is a contemporary, um, almost a commodity expression.
mhm,
Um, whereas and there's a very different framework between the prairie plains and away from the prairie plains. But so when the government was banning, because dance is a very, and I don't like to use the word holy or sacred because there's such Western words. It's very intrinsic to our being.
yeah.
It's, and so when we did our society dances, our ceremony dance, Sundance or Medewin or Horn Society, all of these, it included dance because it's our full soul and being into it. I mean, the closest I could think of is Black church
Mhm,
song, and they get up and they're moving because it's all, the
mhm,
only place where you sit still is institutional religions
mhm.
where you're told to just sit still. So you're right. And so I talk about the colonization. Um, I talk about the Wild West shows, and it was all performative. Um, yeah, I'm just going to pause and think of what else is in your mind. You might want to ask Amy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I actually I want to come back for a moment and just reflect on, you talked about like growing up, in Indigenous history was not a part of your schooling. It certainly wasn't a part of my schooling. It was very much about which nations fought for the British and which nations fought for the French, right?
And
Like,
that's new.
yeah, and that was the extent of our knowledge of Indigenous history when I was growing up. And so, you know, you talk of like both your book and this book, I just want to reflect on the importance of Indigenous voices telling us these stories, giving, you know, that there's the authenticity of that, right? So that we are getting a history that is told to us not from a colonial perspective.
And what I want to say is also, I was writing and then I was saying as an Indigenous faculty member, and then I realized as I was writing that with the topic of, and I'm going to bring this up because it's controversial, is the pretendians. And that means the Michelle Latimer of CBC, the Joseph Boydens, and the list is endless. Gray Eagle, Gray Owl. The list is endless of people. And even I'm in the academy now, through no fault of their own, 60 Scoop people were raised as a status quo citizen.
Mhm.
So when they, and it's awkward because I meet them and they get drawn to me because they want to know what they lost.
Mm.
And I sit there after the third coffee with them, and I'm like, third meeting of coffee, and I'm like, I don't know how to tell them. Sitting with me for coffee, I'm not sure you're going to regain
Mhm.
what you lost. And yes, I did this book. And because you put on an outfit and you do a couple of songs and you move your body, doesn't make you like it's far more um the lived experiences of is very different from those that lost their culture.
Mhm.
So I guess I'm red flagging, and I know that we don't have a role or a function, but I'm red flagging. I'm not gatekeeping. I'm red flagging a constant social media, because most of my social media are res people. Um, I I actually, because I'm not, um, well, there's a whole different, and probably if you look at my social media, I have more of probably Treaty 7 Indigenous people and Ontario, but I don't have like when I teach, I hardly talk about Métis culture because
Mhm.
I'm not familiar with it. Like I can talk a very small amount of it, but I would never say I specialize in Métis culture because I'm not. And so when, because I have an audience here that I'm not sure of the backgrounds and there isn't enough time in the next 20 minutes, 22 minutes to find out the backgrounds. We're talking about contemporary dance expression. So, you know, I was very involved with the BAM Center for many years as one of the faculty instructors. And sometimes I have to admit I felt awkward or ill at ease because some of our cultural practices like face painting, there's a very sacred meaning to it. And so I don't know where the line is, and it's a discussion that
Mhm.
we have many times. Women taking up the hand drum. I'm just like, this is a real question for me. Um, I always remember in an article I read by Hampton, he includes an elder, Wolfleg, and the elders, Wolfleg said in the article, he said, ceremony is something we do, we don't talk about.
Uh-huh. Right.
So my question I ask is it we don't talk about it because if we talked about it prior to 1951, we would be incarcerated. And if you realize, like I was born just past that.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
in my generation of people, because of the Indian agents in those days lived on the reserve. And so when we had a gathering, and again, I have another story, my father's story, I think I talk about. He waited a very long time before my dad told me this story. And this July will be 20 years since my dad has been gone. My dad was born in 1927. he talked about when they had to go way back in the bush and it would be secret. And even the Medewan Society is called secret society. There's still people that call it that today. So because if the Indian agent found out, then we would be there would be repercussions, there would be discipline, there would be punishment. So when Wolf Lake says ceremony is something we do, not talk about, like myself, I have Mishkwakwe, um Mishkwankwitwe, Red Cloud Woman, and Gentle Walking Wind Woman is my Cree name. I just recently put it, but I always thought of my Indian names as separate from my, like I didn't, it's mine.
Uh-huh.
But now I see on social media people saying, oh, I went to a sweat and here's a picture of the sweat lodge, and I went to the Sundance and here's I just like, it's because of my generation that's where um it's it, there isn't a hard and fast rule. I'm
Mhm,
just
mhm.
and I speak with other peers who are knowledge keepers and cultural practitioners, and I say, is this why we keep quiet about it? Is because out of that fear.
Mhm,
Or some people will say, well, I'm just humble and modest, so I don't talk about it.
mhm,
And so, but what I will talk about is grand entry, and that there's X different dance categories, and a song is created by, there's 4 verses which we call push-ups, and there's a round dance song and a straight song and a grass dance song and a jingle dress song. We'll talk, and I talk and I wrote about that. That book took me a long time to write because I struggled with breaching any kind of protocols all along the way.
yeah,
And then I would either do my cultural protocols and offerings or go to see somebody. I said, well, I kind of want to talk about this. And then so that part of negotiating of what I do say took quite some time. um I mean, I wrote that book was, it was released in 2020, which is 3 years ago now. But you know the journey started as a child, and then
mm,
um, it was because of late Greg Younging and Richard Van Camp that said, you got to get Karen Pheasant to write this, because I had worked with Jeanette Armstrong at the Algonquin Center as one of her creative writing instructors. And so as a Anishinaabe, we've been writing for a long time. Andrew Blackbird did a book in 1897. So sometimes when I sit down writing, I think when my fingers do a keyboard dance, I get the same feeling as a really good bullhorn song, and I get to dance to that
mm,
song. I almost, whether my fingers are doing a keyboard dance or I'm doing a shibigashigegan, a jingle dress dance on the floor, it gives me that same joyous feeling.
mhm. Right, right, right. Now, in a prior conversation when you and I were chatting about the book, one of the things I told you was that when I read it, it sort of reminded me of some of the Highland festivals that our family goes to, right?
Hmm.
Like that there were these to me interesting parallels, right? There's dance competitions, there's music, of course, there's food that is specific to the culture, there's vendors selling Celtic jewelry and pottery and things like that. And so it was really interesting to me to see and to hear about how you and your family basically would do a powwow tour throughout the summer. It was like every weekend, okay, well, there's going to be this one is in this location this weekend, and this one is in this location this weekend, and you sort of have it all mapped out. And it's quite similar in terms of the Highland festivals in Ontario, for sure, I can say. And I just, so then this may be a totally stupid question, but Can I, as a non-Indigenous person, attend a powwow? Is that a thing? Because
I'm going to do a question back to you.
okay,
How do you hear about a powwow, Amy?
how do I hear about it? I guess I hear about them in social media, or
Okay, so
yeah,
you hear
you're
about it
right.
in social media.
Yeah, or sometimes you will see an ad in like a newspaper.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. So
exactly. So my
of
question to you is,
course, that would
if
be
there's an
interesting.
ad in a
Yeah, yeah.
newspaper,
It would be for everybody.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
I I um I was just telling this story recently. One of the grand things when I lived in Lethbridge was New Year's Eve. There's a dance, or what is called referred to as a powwow, on the Blood Reserve at Gladstone, and I'm like, I had never heard of that, and I'm like, wow. So that's what we did for New Year's. So then I moved back east again, and there was a big storm, and traffic was bad. The roads were bad, and 2 weeks before, my son Matthew says, I go, I sure miss being out west. I know what we would be doing, going to. He goes, well, Mom, why don't you put one on 2 weeks before New Year's? And I'm there like, sure, because, and then I told my family, what Matthew said, and in my family, so, well, why don't you? Why don't we? And so pulled favors, call this drum, call that arena director, call this MC. We had one.
Wow, amazing.
But why I bring up this story is I started putting ads in the local newspaper, public newspaper.
Uh-huh.
And then a close dear settler friend phoned me and asked, so could we come? And I was like, I said to her, just like I said to you, like, if it's in the newspaper.
Yeah, then of course, that seems so obvious now.
Yeah. So it has, I look at someone when they say that and I go, sometimes I just walk away because
Yeah, yeah. But
but
you know, I
but
think
what I wanted to
oh,
say is you have to listen to the MCs, and I say that in my book. And there's something called intertribal dance. So I don't know how many powwows you've gone to, but there's the most popular one in the Toronto area is Six Nations. You have to go to that. So they call everybody, like anybody respectfully can go, and I think I talk about that in the book.
uh-huh.
They're welcome. And I was just saying too that in the US, not here in Canada, but particularly in the Eastern Seaboard, they have what they call hobbyist groups.
Okay.
And there's even been books done by hobbyists. And you'll go to these powwows by hobbyists. They have all drummers and all dancers. And yeah, and there was a guy named Willie from Germany who used to come to the Blood Reserve and be help with the Heelys at the Indian village at the Stampede. And he learned how to make smoked hide, and he made the best smoked hide, and he learned to talk Blackfoot. And so on that topic, I realize I'm going a bit off, but it's very interesting. In Germany, there's a population that loves us. And
Yeah.
actually, a friend of mine, a colleague who's now at McMaster, Renee Watchman, she's actually written about it. So they ship plane loads of us over there, and
Oh,
and they have mock um battles, and they yeah, so
yeah, it is fat. Troy actually was the first to tell me about that. And it's fascinating. But it was when we were working on an exhibit together, and some of the images that we were looking at were of it would be a picture. I think it was a picture of five Bella Kula dancers, and the picture was taken because they they were taken to Europe to perform, and I guess that's where it caught on, right? And that's in the 19th century that was happening,
mhm,
that they were taken.
including with Buffalo Bill going over
Yes,
there. Yeah,
of course.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. But I think part of my that question about, well, can I go? I think it's rooted in the fact that, the fact that Indigenous cultures and Indigenous history was oppressed for so long, it's like we've all been robbed, right? We didn't get, like, as a white person and a descendant of settlers, I didn't get to grow up with Indigenous friends and learning about their cultures just like they might learn about my cultures, and they might try Newfoundland foods like I might try, you know, Dutch foods with my friends who, came from Holland, that kind of thing, right? So there is this, like, really, because we didn't get to grow up together in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like,
And so I really appreciate it. I'm going to bring up what Senator Marie Sinclair said is the school curriculum, the school system, Canadian school system, and probably North America, the US, perpetuates white supremacy.
mhm,
I have a story that I share, and we only have 9 minutes left, but my mom remembers watching her dad. My mom was born in 1933, and as a child, she said her dad's hands were really grimy. So he took some coal oil to clean his hands, and his hands got really clean. And she saw, and this is back in the days when they used outhouses. And
mhm.
I probably have a lot of young people here that don't know what a Eaton's catalog is, but in my day, that was the toilet paper in the outhouse. And so that would be in the outhouse, and she just, the better life, the myth of that. So she talks about, well, she waited for her parents to leave, and she put the coal oil lamp by the wood stove and took the coal oil and started, because she wanted her skin to be white. And when I tell this story, and if there's a First Nations audience, so many of them have the same story. And I think you could probably pick up any one of the dozen books that are popular right now by Aboriginal writers, and they have that same story of wanting to be white.
Mm,
And so partly because as a teenager, I'm talking about the early 70s. I really am grateful being a young youth during the civil rights movement,
mhm.
and my dad or parents being news junkies. So I still have the Kent State affair like vivid in my mind,
Yeah.
watching it on TV and JFK
Mm,
being killed. All these are the pictures that I grew up in society, and then listening to my dad bang the table, or Jeanette Corbett-Laval, whose birthday, by the way, was yesterday, and she's who got Bill C-31, Indigenous woman getting their rights back. As I said, our kitchen table, our home was a Grand Central Station.
mm,
You know, people coming through, Jeanette Corbett-Laval being one of them, and her fights to keep her rights. So that was, about the reminders of who we are as Anishinaabe. And so I I did not ever have, "Well, I wish my skin was lighter."
mm.
I didn't have that. Um I just always think it doesn't matter that we're beautiful. But I want to go back to you bringing up the dance. And I just want to, because I don't know who my audience members is, but because this is the DCD, um, dance and the river dance, I understand. And I'm not a dance historian overview, but I know that part of that was about rights, about coming out of oppression. And there's one dance, and I don't know if it made its way to Toronto, but on Broadway, I forget even the name of the dance, but it's referred to as one of the black dances, where it's foot stomping, foot stomp.
Okay.
And what I understand about the foot stomp is it came out of the mines in Africa. And because when they sent the basically slaves down into the mines, this is before the canary bird, and I realize I'm talking about stuff that people might not know about, but it was safety issues, hazard issues. And
Mhm,
so they would send the black workers down into the mines, and
mhm.
they made a code system by stomping on the ground about the mines down below on safety.
Right.
And then in the evening, it became a social. And
Uh-huh.
then now you hear about stomp dance. And I'm almost sure most Indigenous, including Mardi Gras,
Uh-huh.
like the roots of our dance, of that dance, of BIPOC dance, of Indigenous dance, have a lot of retaining who we are as an empowerment
Yeah. Yeah.
path. And so the Powwow dance, likewise, I'll just quickly maybe conclude with this, is and crossing the plains, I think the book, anyway, the idea of colonizers, of federal policies, was put us into residential schools. I have a quote from the principal at Wikwemikong in the 1800s, said, as good moral people as they be, they don't have something about intellectual capabilities,
Yeah.
because they measure intellectual capabilities by their yardstick.
Yes.
Which, of course, if you understand about Irish and British English history, it was more about elitism and aristocracy, about money, not about intellectualism.
Yeah.
And so the idea of the federal government was to make us all farmers.
Mhm.
And the farming legislation they did here in the Prairie Province is nothing like Ontario, because it always favored the white farmer. So that's all they thought. And same with the World Expo, whether the one in Seattle or the one in Spokane, 100 years ago, it was always about the federal government telling the world, see, because if you Google the term vanishing Indian, I think there's even a couple of textbooks on the topic of the vanishing Indian. The government was always about kill the Indian, save the man.
Mm.
And Duncan Campbell Scott, get rid of the Indians so there's not a Indian political body. So these World Expo and the Buffalo Bill shows was always the government's way of saying, see, we take care of them. Look don't they look beautiful? And
Yeah.
people oohing and awing.
Yeah.
Like I still powwow dance, but if I see some tourists coming, I run the other way, because they somehow think it's okay to start touching us.
Oh, really?
And touching my hair. And I'm like, where in the world is it okay to walk up to somebody and start touching their hair?
Yeah.
Like, I do it for the love of dance and being with my people.
Yeah.
But in a Western sense, it's called a performance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I love to dance, but the realities is it's called performance. And not to say I'm anti. I have applied to Canada Council for the Arts. I've applied to Ontario Art Council, and I do consider myself an artist. I do consider myself a performer. I work in the studio. The Bajra Jig produced one of my stories. And so, but I just do think there's an ethical way in which we do it.
Yeah.
And that is worthy of I don't know. Hopefully Troy and I have that long conversation that I said we would. We're
Yeah.
both in Banff. I'll be returning to Banff this July as guest faculty, and Troy will be there working on a piece. So I'm excited to just sit down and talk about these, because there's very few people who come from that same epistemological, ontological, just being Indian.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah, Miigwech Chai Hai.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to take 1 second in our last 2 minutes here to show.
Well, this is
Oh.
the Troy.
Okay. I'm just going to share my screen for 1 second, because I
Okay.
want to show people. We call this DCD Discover Dialogues, and I wanted to bring up DCD Discover, which is a big digital project that we have been working on to help not only get our collection out and accessible to the world, but also as a place where artists and other heritage organizations can place their dance materials. And so gradually we will have all of our library books on here, not the contents of the books, because that's copyrighted, but an entry so that people know what books we have. So here we have Karen's book, and this is all the sort of
and I'd like to suggest that you put Indigenous Toronto. I make reference to Renee, and there's an interview with Thompson Highway in there, and he talks about his brother Renee. And so he was the trailblazer of merging contemporary dance and however we define Indigenous dance. And you could speak to Troy and I and have a whole panel of 10 of us, and I'm almost sure the 10 of us are going to have a different interpretation of how we approach Indigenous dance to the contemporary dance expression forum.
Yes, absolutely. And we will, as I say, we will eventually have all of our library books in there. And of course, this Indigenous Toronto is also a part of our library.
Awesome.
So, and I will just put the link here, just so everyone knows how to get to DCD Discover. So there it is. So there we've
Amy, thank you so much. It's been great chatting and visiting, and even our preliminary talk that we have. Miigwech to each and every one of you joining. Hugs to Troy for being with you. Love you so much. Best wishes.
Thanks,
Take
Karen.
care.
We'll see you in Banff. Travel safe. Love ya.
Okay, see ya. Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
so much, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining us. We'll sign off there.
Bye, Amy.
Bye-bye, Troy.